Okay, great. So thank you for joining us here in Madrid. And I'm really grateful to be hosting Paul Mendez and Okechukwu Nzelu, discussing and reading from their books, which I've got them here, Rainbow Milk and the Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. And if this is your first introduction to these books, I really do recommend that you read them as soon as possible. In a second, I'll shut up and Paul and Okechukwu are going to talk and have a chat. And before I do, I just want to do some thanks. Firstly, to Dialogue Books. We really love their work and everything they're doing, and it feels so vital. So if you've not already discovered all of their works, then I really recommend you do. I'll be putting a link to their latest blog post in the chat in a second. I'd like to thank Millie from Dialogue, who put us in touch with Okechukwu and Paul. And finally, Niven Govindan, who is a wonderful, beautiful person and an amazing writer. He was the judge for this year's Literary Prize. And if you've not read his most recent book, This Brutal House, which is also with Dialogue, then I suggest you get a copy. Here it is in paperback. He actually pointed us in the direction of Paul and Okechukwu as a pairing, and there's so many things that link these two works, and I'm so really grateful for him to putting me in that direction. So as I said, I'll be posting some things in the chat. There's a couple of links of where to buy books. If you're in the EU, you can get them from us. And if you're in Britain, and saying that is very weird still, you can get them from Burley Fisher. That's where we're recommending you get them in London, our friends. There's a link to the Dialogue Books post. And finally, if you want to donate to Let's Book Literature, if you can, if you have the means and the will, your support is really helpful to this sort of continued effects of COVID. And we're going to share all the donations with the authors. So if you can help out, that'd be great. At the end, we'll be opening up for questions, and I'll mention how we do that then. But until then, I guess it's time to welcome Paul and Okechukwu. So thank you for being here, both of you, and I'll now shut
up. Thank you so much for organising this. It's so lovely.
It's a pleasure to have you both. Let me see. Have we lost? Wait, is he? Where is he? He's muted.
Yeah.
Did he go in? Okay. Ask to unmute. Maybe he dropped out a second.
Yay, thank you. Hi. I don't blame you for trying to shut me up before we even started.
Let's keep this interview short and sweet, Paul.
Exactly.
We've all got stuff to do. 5 seconds.
Friday night, we've got to go out and get some, sun. How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I've had a lovely day out in the sunshine, and I'm now covered in flies, and I'm sneezing like nothing because I've got a terrible hay fever. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. My hay fever's been okay today. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
I've been taking cetrizine hydrochloride or something like that. I can't remember what it's called.
Ooh, that sounds scary. But
it's just sort of like a generic hay fever medicine, but I get a grass pollen allergy sort of right from February onwards, or tree pollen. But it was actually sort of delayed this year because of the coronavirus, I think.
Yeah, because none of the steam grass or trees and
Well, exactly. Yeah, and I was fine. And then sort of the lockdown ended, and I was like, all of a sudden, I was kind of assailed. But no, I'm okay. I'm not too bad. I've had quite a nice day. Did a Zoom with Niven this morning, which was, as always, really great value, great chat. And apart from that, I've been napping because I got drunk last night, and a bit hungover. So, but I'm good. I'm okay now. So should we introduce each other properly? What do you think?
I've left my copy of Rainbow Milk at home, which is really frustrating.
Well, maybe you could introduce yourself then.
Shall we introduce ourselves?
Fantastic.
Yeah, you go first.
Okay. So I'll just speak about myself in third person then. Paul Mendez was born in Dudley in 1982. He began writing in 2002 and has contributed to the Times Literary Supplement and the Brixton Review of Books. Rainbow Milk is his first novel. And if you haven't read it yet, why? Yes, there's a gentleman there who's got it. Brilliant. Wonderful.
I can vouch for this. If you haven't read it, I would thoroughly recommend that you read it. I know that we're introducing ourselves, but I'm just going to jump on it and say I loved it. I loved it. It was...
Thank you.
I've never read anything like it. It is so bold and fluent and magical, and it's just this wonderful, beautiful novel that I thoroughly recommend that you all read. And yeah, I guess to introduce myself, I'll just read my bio off the back of my book because I've forgotten who I am. Okechukwu Nzelu is a writer and teacher. He was born in Manchester in 1988. That number may change as the years go by. Read English at Cambridge and completed the Teach First programme. His work has been published in Agenda, PM Review, magazine The Literature, and The Literature even, and in 2013, his radio play, Me and Alan, was broadcast on Roundhouse Radio. His essay, Troubles with God, was published in the anthology Safe on Black British Memory Claiming Space. In 2015, he was a recipient of a New Writing North Award, and The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney is his debut novel. So, yeah, that's me.
Which I can vouch for as well, is a wonderful book. Like, very funny, very smoothly, elegantly written. And I kind of want to ask you actually, like, in terms of, how did you sort of come about Nnenna as a character? Like, what made you sort of channel this story through a 15-year-old biracial girl?
Yeah, this process of coming up with the characters was a long one for me. So this novel took me about 8 years from start to finish to write, and it went through so many different iterations and versions. And at the start of the process, the idea that I had at the very beginning was very, very different from what it ended up being. It just evolved. So at first I thought, maybe I'm going to write about a group of teenagers who are friends, and I'd like to write about kind of being young and feeling lost and growing up. And then that completely changed, and I realized I didn't want to write about that. I began to think about my writing in terms of dynamics, which I think I still do now, sort of relationships rather than individuals. And so I thought, right, I want to write about a single parent family because that was my own experience. I want to write about the experience of being of Nigerian heritage, at least in part, but also not quite knowing how to navigate that relationship, which is something, again, that I'm also familiar with in my own separate way from Nnenna's. And it was something I kind of landed on after a couple of sort of failed attempts at sort of failed launches of the novel. I thought, right, I'm going to start it this way. No, I'm going to start it that way. And I went through a couple of different changes. And it just ended up being almost by accident, really, that I settled on this version of the story that I thought, now I'm happy with this. And the same was really true for my style of writing. I really stumbled on it. You know, people talk about finding your voice. For me, I really did find it almost by accident. Like, I didn't know what kind of novel I wanted to write until I wrote it. How was the process for you? Because for you, I think you started off as thinking about a memoir, and then it became fiction. And how was that process for you, and switching between the two?
Sort of fairly similar, because Rainbow Milk originally was based upon my own experiences. So what was very, very important for me to conserve was the transition that happened in my life between being a 17-year-old devout Jehovah's Witness. And again, you know, we have the sort of the Christian aspects of things in common, and, you know, that relationship is very much brought out and expanded in both novels. But, you know, from me being a 17-year-old devout Jehovah's Witness to being disfellowshipped, and then 5 years later living in London without family and living as a sex worker, and that being my sort of career. And, you know, for me, it was just a case of conserving that sort of transition and that life trajectory, and trying to explain how I got there, and how I've emerged, like what I've learned. So, but the thing was with me, I sort of found it very difficult to write about certain experiences because they were perhaps too painful. So meeting Charmaine sort of made the difference, really, because she was the one who empowered me to turn it into fiction. And even then, there were several steps that I needed to sort of go through in terms of finding the character's voice, in terms of playing with time, playing with tone, and also towards the end of the process, switching from first to third person, because then that gave me the real kind of distance that I needed. Suddenly became someone else I was talking about, and it was just very strange how that happened. It was no longer me, and it suddenly became someone called Jesse, who he was born on the same day as me. He sort of has the same kind of descriptors, but ended up being very different, and also introducing characters who are nothing to do with my history either, such as his stepfather Graham. So that was a very different experience from what I had. Like, my parents are both black; they're both still married, but in Rainbow Milk, Jesse's mother marries a white Jehovah's Witness when Jesse's 4 years old, and so Jesse is raised by a white man, and then we get to sort of have a conversation about black masculinity as defined by whiteness and as defined by white masculinity, which became a much more sort of interesting way to then lead into Jesse's sort of career as a sex worker. So it was just a series of decisions and a series of kind of mind changes, and much probably to Charmaine's chagrin at times, because I handed in manuscripts and then 3 days later sort of retracted them, saying this isn't the book, this isn't right. But I mean, did you have any sort of moments like that where you kind of thought, is this really, because you're writing a book that's 100,000 words long, so were there any moments where you kind of felt that you were really quite far in but had to retract, or had to sort of change things fundamentally?
There were many moments early on in the novel's process, because I met Charmaine basically when the manuscript was not ready to go, but like there was a fairly short, intense but fairly short editing process, and so that by the time I met Charmaine, I'd already sort of been through that so many times in my head. I redrafted it. I redrafted it so many times, once just to make it funny. I like you, I experimented with tone, and it's so important, and you don't realise perhaps until you start writing, which is something else I'd like to talk to you about before I forget. But you don't realise, I certainly didn't realise until I started writing, that the same how you tell the story is part of the story itself. The two are indivisible. If for me, comedy, if this story hadn't been comic, then it would have been very different. The feelings that I want people to feel, that I feel myself when I'm writing, are so different depending on the tone of the story. So by the time I came to Charmaine, the sort of structural edits that we went through, I think from what you've said, I think it was just a slightly shorter process. So one big thing was the ending. The novel ended differently. I added an ending onto it. I spoke to Charmaine. I'd handed her the manuscript, I think, and then in between my handing Charmaine the manuscript and Charmaine sort of talking to me about it and giving me her thoughts on what she thought it needed, I thought, I'm not happy with this ending. I want it to be different. And what was really good and really lovely was that Charmaine, one of the things she said, one of the first things Charmaine said was, I don't think the ending as it is quite there. And I said, well, I have something for you. And I said, you should end like this. And she's like, okay, that's great. And it was this wonderful synchronicity that I think just really also sums up how Charmaine works. Like, she's very hands-on in that she's very present, but also she trusts. She gives a lot of trust, and that really pays off, and it's so valuable. I think the book and my experience would have been so different had I not had that. But yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, sort of, because there's so many things in what you said that I sort of wanted to bounce off. So I'll try and get through them. But one of the things you mentioned early on was that you started writing. Were you sort of 20 years old when you started writing?
Yeah.
And so, what made you want to write? What was it? What was the impetus for you?
Again, so being disfellowshipped from the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. So if anyone doesn't know quite what that means, so the Jehovah's Witnesses are a very sort of insular community, and they only really associate with each other. They don't associate with what they call worldly people or do worldly things. So they will go to pubs, they will go to, 10-pin bowling or something like that, but it's always with other Jehovah's Witnesses. It's never sort of with work colleagues or anything like that. So you're kind of raised in a community where everyone's your auntie, everyone's your uncle, whether they're white, black, or whatever. And when you're in that, and you're sort of in that because you subscribe fully to their doctrine and don't dissent in any way at all, it's a very wonderful place to be. It's a very sort of protecting familial atmosphere. But once you step outside of that, you're cut off completely. So I was 17 years old when I was cut off completely from my congregation, from my family. I was exiled totally. No one would speak to me, etc., etc. So all of a sudden, you don't know anything about the world outside, and yet you're sort of cast out into it. And I guess by the age of 20, I'd moved. So I grew up in the West Midlands, and at the age of 20, I was living in Kent, which is sort of 200 miles away, but a million miles away. It's very white middle class, very sort of a much wealthier, much different environment to the industrial environment in which I grew up. And I just had to find myself, had to find my voice. And again, there's just always been this need for me to keep track of my trajectory, because I feel like I could be lost otherwise. There's maybe just a fear there that I could be lost if I don't sort of keep track of where I've been and sort of try to sort of like write a path in front of my feet almost. And it was really what precipitated writing for me was the summer of 2002. I saw the film Amores Perros, which was Gal Garcia Bernal's acting debut, and it's a Mexican film about. And what happens at the start is this huge bone-crunching car crash, just completely devastating and shocking. But then what happens after that is you spend the next sort of 2 hours following the lives of the people who are involved in this crash. And I kind of thought to myself, wow, like, this cataclysmic event that changes everyone's lives. And I grew up thinking that Armageddon was going to happen one day, and all the evil in the world would be sort of like crushed. And so I had this kind of Armageddonist kind of reading of this film, and thought to myself, this is kind of a way for me to sort of start explaining things to myself, and to because when you lose that center of gravity that religion gives you, you have to find something to replace it. Otherwise, you are lost. So there was that, and then also that summer I read James Baldwin for the first time. So I read Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, which is one of his lesser known novels, published in 1968. A great book. And it also happened to be the first time that I had ever read anything from the point of view of a black queer man. So he's an actor who, at the start of the novel, has a heart attack on stage, and he's sort of like rushed to hospital and everything, and then it sort of goes into the past, and sort of shows him in relationships with a black radical man, sort of someone from the Black Panthers or something, and then also with a white woman, and it just sort of explores his relationships as an actor starting out in his career. And again, I was just so inspired by that, and also by J.T. Leroy's The Heart is Deceitful Above All Things, about a young, I guess we would call them non-binary now, but at the time I didn't think I had the language for that back then when I was reading, whose mother was a sex worker and used to sort of travel around the sort of truck stops of, I can't remember whether was it LA or Vegas? I can't remember. I've got it on my shelf, but anyway. And it was just like a road movie, and it was all of these sort of interconnected short stories along those lines. And so all of these kind of literary and cinematic influences sort of came in and really sort of made me think that, you know, writing could be my way just to explain things to myself and to give myself a future. To you know, we're just not used to seeing Black queer men in literature, first of all. And so, you know, I almost have to write the story myself. And that's kind of the mentality that I had. How about you? Like, did you, you know, when there are so few of us and there are so sort of few precursors, like what gives you the confidence to write a whole novel?
I mean, good question. I think for me, my experience is probably very different from yours in that I've pretty much always written. I've always, you know, one of my earliest memories is of writing, like, you know, the kind of kids stories that kids write that about ridiculous things that don't make sense and don't add up, and it's not really a story, it's just a bunch of things that are completely unconnected and lead nowhere. But that was just, it always seemed like the most logical and rational thing to do once I learned how to write words. I guess I just thought that's what writing was for at the time. I thought that's what words were for. And my relationship with writing has really changed as I've got older, as my relationship with literature has changed. My education was really traditional. You know, I learned a lot from Cambridge when I went there, but it's a very traditional course. You take, you know,
Did you do English?
Yeah. And, you know, it takes you through the, you know, what I studied was basically from 1066 until the present day, very British Isles focused. Like I did my dissertation on The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, which is one of my favourite novels in the world. But my education formally was very traditional, and so most of the stuff that isn't by white British men is stuff that I've gone out and read for myself and found for myself. And, you know, I don't want to sound bitter about that at all, because I've had a fantastic education, but at the same time, I think that ties quite closely in with your experience, in that I haven't really seen myself reflected in the things that I've been taught. And that really influences my writing in terms of who I want to focus on. So in my novel, the character of Jonathan, most of what we see of Jonathan, this gay Black man who's having a terrible time in his romantic life, most of what we see from him is in monologues. And I did that deliberately because so often when we see gay men of colour, never mind Black men, their experiences are sort of mediated through the prism of white guilt, or through sort of the white person's experience of racism. How do I respond? How should I feel? And then the person of colour, the Black man, if the Black gay man, if he is even in the narrative, is at the sidelines, and his emotions and his experiences aren't prioritised. They're merely the setting for white guilt or whatever that white person might be feeling. And I wanted to make it impossible for the reader to look away. I wanted the reader to have nowhere else to look but at this Black man's experience. And that was really important to me because, you know, as much as I value theory and ideals, and as much as I think those things are really important in anti-racism and in moving forward, I think it's so important to centre emotion. So important to centre emotion, because it's so easy for us to get, and we should think about, you know, strategically, we should think about what do we do nationwide? How do we, you know, effect nationwide change? And also it's so easy to think about, to sort of forget to talk about emotion, because it's not something that is necessarily easy to do, because you have to admit that you're vulnerable. And being vulnerable, admitting that you have been victimized, is a difficult thing to do. Even if you're not talking about an individual act of victimization, even if you're talking about, you know, something that happens societally, it's really difficult to say, I have been hurt. But at the same time, that is really at the heart of what is bad about racism. Like, it is bad because we are hurting and killing people, and that needs to be centered. So I really wanted to make it impossible for the reader to look away from that pain, because for me, that has to be the center of it. That has to be the emotions at the center of it have to be what drives the movement forward and upward.
Yeah, I totally see that. And, you know, we don't see Black male vulnerability explored much in any arena. And I think that's one of the things that strikes Jesse first when he is listening to Jay-Z's The Blueprint with Fraser early on in the book. And, there's 2 songs on that album, Never Change and Song Cry, which sort of merge one into the other. And what Jesse is hearing is this kind of like this failing in the voice of Jay-Z, where he's obviously speaking very, very tenderly to someone of the same sex and a black man, and he's very emotional. And Jesse's just never really been exposed to that before, and has never really sort of, when he sees Steve McQueen's Bear at the Tate Modern, and he sees 2 naked black men wrestling and kind of grimacing and kind of really sort of engaged in physical contact, it's like a real revelation to him, because he doesn't think before he's seen that he's ever sort of and also we're almost raised to think that homosexuality isn't black as well.
I mean, we are absolutely raised to think that. I mean, absolutely, it is. In my experience, it's explicit. I don't know about yours, but in my experience, it was, along with mental health problems and not straight A stars. That's a white people thing. Like, we don't do that. Like, you can keep your like homosexuality and your like not being the best in your class and being depressed and anxious. That's for white people. You have to be this, and that's a really difficult prison to break out of.
Well, I mean, coming to education, I really think that like that's where our heritages differ, because I'm from the Jamaican diaspora, and we are not expected to be academically brilliant. In fact, like, it's a source of mistrust if you present yourself as being too clever. And I just never really felt like I had the support of my parents that someone from your heritage probably would take for granted, or like almost be oppressed by, like this kind of idea that your parents are sort of pushing you to be better, and that you have to compete, that you have to be the best because you compete. I mean, don't get me wrong, like I was told by my grandmother maybe when I was 10, 11 years old, and I think this is something that most black people will say, that they've had this conversation with an elder. You have to be twice as good as the equivalent white person to get half as much. And, that stayed with me, because at the time I was top of the class at that time, and I was head boy at my primary school. There were only 2 black boys in my year, and I was one of them, and I was head boy, and that was kind of a real source of pride for me. So I was kind of thinking, what white supremacy? Like, I'm the best. But that's before I became a teenager, and that's before I felt people started to see me based on their own idea of what a black teenage boy is, and that I include my mother in that, because of internalized racism. All of a sudden she's got a black teenage boy to deal with in her house, and it's interesting what you were saying in terms of the black experience being filtered through white guilt, and I've definitely sort of thought recently with Black Lives Matter, and the sort of the global, rightly so, the global sort of outpouring of anguish that greeted George Floyd's death. I don't know about you, but I've been feeling like that for years about, everyone from Trayvon Martin to now. Like, I've kind of been thinking, like, wow, like, is this the world that we're living in? Is this what it means to be a black person who finds themselves somewhere that someone feels that they're not supposed to be, so they call the police, or they take the law into their own hands? I've been feeling like that for years. I've been feeling a way about that for years, and writing about it, etc., etc. And I'm sort of tired, I don't know about you, I'm tired every time something like this comes along. It sort of makes your shoulders drop a little bit more. Statistics show that there is a spike in mental health issues within all black people from all diasporas when we have to confront something like that. But then, after George Floyd, and everyone all of a sudden wants to be woke and wants to do the work, etc., and is asking you for advice and asking you to help fix the problem. It's very, very difficult, because you're kind of thinking, okay, change is probably going to happen now. But again, it's not because we have forced the change, it's because we've had to convince white people that the change needs to happen. And then, so therefore now it's going to be on their terms and on their time schedule. And, you know, I found that very difficult. I don't know, like, how have you been coping with all of that? Is that too sort of deep a question to ask?
No, not at all. And I think you really summed it up with exhaustion. You know, that has been, for me, the hardest, or one of the hardest things about this lockdown period, is an exhaustion that I've never really felt on this scale before. And it's not because these issues are new, because, as you say, they're not new. This has been happening for a long time. The system isn't broken. This is part of the system. This is not new. But the feeling of like, and I can't even necessarily articulate it, but just the awareness of it is so exhausting. It's a little bit like, as I'm sure you've experienced, being the only Black person in a room at work when an issue of racism is brought up. And just in anticipation of the conversation you're going to have, a part of you just thinks, oh, you know, like, and it's that, but like times 1,000. It's this kind of the foregrounding of the suffering that you have been aware of for a long time, with, I guess, a kind of anxiety about what is or isn't going to be done about it. I think maybe that for me is where my exhaustion comes from. It's this kind of feeling of, okay, none of this is new, but the reaction and the unpredictability of that reaction is new. You know, reading about, you know, just the responses to, you know, very sensible, historical, logical, anti-racist responses. You know, the way that people respond to those with quite determined stupidity, I think, a lot of the time, it's just exhausting. Like, the amount of people who are given a platform, and this is one of the things I think is one of the most unfair things about being a Black person in the public eye, is, you know, if you are somebody like Afua Hirsch, who has to, you know, speaks her mind on television, knows the facts, knows the history, you really have to be very educated to know the things that she knows, to be able to articulate those things. It takes a profound amount of skill and knowledge, but to be able to say the reverse and the opposite takes nothing. You just have to be an ignorant person with an opinion. And what I find so frustrating about this, the nature, I'm wandering off the course now, but what I find so frustrating about the nature of this discourse is that the weight of the burden of this work is put on a Black person. The burden of this work is put on the person who is most affected by it and who is most impacted by it. The cost of it is not on the shoulders of the idiot who has never picked up a book. The burden of this is not on somebody who speaks before they think. The burden is on you to kind of, and this is, you know, I'm sure like you, the amount of times I've had, you know, stereotypes about Black men sort of shoved in my face, the amount of times I've had to say, well, actually, that's not true because this. Actually, I think if you read the books, you'll find this. I just, especially now as a teacher, I'm very, very aware of how much work it takes to correct what is wrong and how difficult that is. You know, not all of us are Afua Hirsch. Not all of us have that, you know, that detailed knowledge and education of the things that she knows and that she's gone away and sort of and taken the time and read. Not all of us have done that. And one of the things, exactly, and one of the things that I wrote about in my book was, you know, for Nnenna, part of the reason that I chose a teenager is because I want to write about vulnerable people in some ways. I'm not writing about people on the sort of edges of society, as it were. I don't want to suggest that Nnenna is underprivileged exactly, but it's more that I wanted to write about people who are in really difficult, unfair situations, who are on the edges of things in some way. So for Nnenna, she's Black, but she doesn't have a Black parent that she's in touch with. She has no connection to that. And so her father, who we meet in flashbacks, her father Morris has had his parents have told him, you are going to go to England from Nigeria. You will have to work twice as hard to get half of what the white people around you get. His parents have educated him in that way. Nnenna hasn't had that. She hasn't had anybody who can lead her forward in that. And Jonathan, in a sort of similar way, he is, he's an adult, he's more mature than Nnenna in some ways, but he's also vulnerable in that his mental health poses a vulnerability to him and exposes him to the cruelties, really, of the queer community towards people of colour. And he is unable, I don't want to say defenceless, but in a way I think that's quite true. He has no real defense against the things that he's put through at first, and the novel for him is for him journeying towards a place where he builds those up and he knows himself better.
Yeah, because he's moved from another city. Does he live in London mostly?
Yeah, he moves up
and then moves up to Manchester, and he's of a certain age as well. And we know about racism and we know about ageism in the gay community. So for him, it's like a real kind of he's just really done it to himself, like moving up to Manchester, trying to sort of fit in, trying to have a social life, trying to have a sex life, where unfortunately he ends up being abused because of his vulnerability and because of his sort of emotional availability, I think. And that is really difficult, and I suppose you can see that in Nnenna potentially, which is why he sort of is such an ally for her, sort of going through the book. But it's really interesting, this point about, both our protagonists are people of colour, but they have a white parent who fails to prepare them for what life is going to be like as a Black person going forward. But I think what's beautiful about both Jessie and Nnenna is they eventually work it out for themselves, I suppose, before it gets too late. And one of the ways that you do it is with language, I think. So Nnenna is a prodigy at French, but then she's offered. Sorry, stop me if I'm giving away too many spoilers. But
No.
That book's been out for time. You should have read it already.
No, it's towards the beginning of the novel. It's fine. It's towards the beginning. It's in the first few chapters.
Yeah, exactly. So her French teacher tells Nnenna's mother at parents' evening, we think that you should sort of apply to the Sorbonne, so she can go there and study French because she's brilliant. And Nnenna wants to go along with that, whereas her mother is kind of she's just sort of, she has this kind of almost unquantifiable sort of reaction to it, and unjustifiable reaction, because you would think that, especially given what you've said about Nigerian parents, you'd think that she'd be jumping up and down being like, yes, my child's going to be going to Paris and going to the Sorbonne. But Nnenna's mother has a very, very different response, which then eventually leads to Nnenna. I don't know whether this was a deliberate thing or not, but Nnenna decides that she actually wants to study Igbo. And so kind of, how did you sort of land on that as a storyline? Because I think that's fascinating in terms of, it's not even English, it's French that Nnenna wants to study. Shows this great aptitude in it, but obviously does in English as well, but French in particular. But there's like a real sort of turning off the main road in order to go back and study Igbo, in order to obviously to connect with her history. Like, can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, I think language is certainly one of the most obvious elements of culture, isn't it, and of civilization. And, one of the things that, for me, what's really important about Nnenna's journey is that her journey towards studying Igbo is actually launched by her boyfriend. And this is part of a bigger story, because Nnenna, as you say, she's a prodigy. She's this very, very intelligent, proficient student of French. But her boyfriend, Danny, is not very bright. He is a man who is white and, in the sort of patriarchal hierarchy, he's above her. But at the same time, he's also very aware that his friends say that he's punching above his weight. He doesn't deserve somebody like Nnenna because she is smarter than him, she's prettier than him, she's got something that he hasn't got. And so what happens is, in a sort of an offhand comment to Nnenna, Danny says, what, you can speak French, but you can't speak your own language, in this way that's actually meant to undermine her confidence because of his jealousy. But then I really wanted to present that because that is so much a part of what makes Nnenna vulnerable. She is vulnerable to really the insecurities of somebody who doesn't deserve her time, actually. Somebody who doesn't respect her as much as he ought to, and really doesn't treat her properly, if you look at the whole picture. But she's vulnerable to that in a way that she might not have been had her father been present. And I really wanted to present that kind of the vulnerability, because, you know, for me, my journey is different from Nnenna's in that I'm older, I'm male, I have a connection to my culture that Nnenna doesn't have. But it's also partly my experience. My older brother speaks Igbo fluently. I don't. He learned it as a child. I didn't. I've had to formally try and learn it. And that's quite a common thing, I think, for second children. I can't remember why. There's some research on something that goes on in the playground or something like that makes that quite a common pattern.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I wish I could remember the research on it. There's some very specific reason. But yeah, that was really something I wanted to reflect, because that's a big part of the sort of the separation, I guess, I felt from Igbo culture. Partly because of the language, but also partly because it's not somewhere I'm ever going to live. As I'm sure Nigeria's anti-homosexuality laws are very strict and, deeply, deeply problematic, to the point where this place that is my heritage and that I feel like I have a really deep connection to in some ways is worlds apart. I can't live there. So I really wanted to get a sense of sort of Nnenna having a very obvious connection to her culture in terms of her father, but a sense of and her ability to get there in terms of the language, and her independence in terms of her ability to find her own way there, which I think in your novel plays out in a different way in terms of Jesse's. I mean, he is vulnerable. He absolutely is exposed to all sorts of things that he doesn't deserve. But at the same time, what shines through his personality is, and this is good, I don't want this to sound corny. I don't know how to express it in a way that's not corny, but his determination and his human drive, I can't think of a better word for it than that, to find the life that is best for him and that is right for him. And figuring out what that looks like when you are so young and you haven't known anything else outside of the Jehovah's community. I remember there's a really powerful moment in the novel where he talks about being, he says, it would be like I'd be your husband.
I'd be like your girlfriend. Yeah.
Because he's trying to figure out the vocabulary for the person that how do I express what I want? How do I put in words the person that I would see myself being? In fact, would you like to read now?
Shall I? I was thinking, I could read that bit if you want. Do you want me to read that bit? That would be a really
great read, yeah.
Okay. See if I can find it.
Terry, can I just ask how we're doing for time? How much time have you got left in terms of?
Yeah, I was just sort of flowing along with the joy of the.
Yeah, me too.
I sent a very cheeky little message to Paul saying, "Can I have a reading, please?" Because I got so.
I see.
You beat me to it. Okay, I was just about to sort of interrupt and say, let's.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So I guess we 15, 20 minutes more. I mean, I definitely just want to keep listening forever, but I know.
Okay, so I am going to read from the section that Oki has just beautifully set up. So Jesse, at this point, is 19 years old. This is September 2001, just after 9/11. And he is with another brother from his congregation, but this brother, he's white, he's a couple of years older than Jesse, and he is quite worldly, and in that he doesn't really participate at the meetings or anything like that. But Jesse, without knowing what his feelings are and not really having the words for them, because homosexuality is anathema to the witnesses, he still sort of feels these very, very strong feelings towards Fraser. So this is from page 80. and I'm going to use accents. So I'm sorry if you aren't familiar with the Brahmi accent, you will be now. What should I... Do you ever think about leaving? Sometimes. Not sure where I'd go, though. You? Sorry, let me just start that again. I got it wrong. Okay. Do you ever think about leaving? Says Jessie. Sometimes. Not sure where I'd go, though. You? Never. I look at the world out there. All the wars. All the stupidity. The organisation isn't perfect, but it's better than out there. And if I can stay in it with people like you in it. Fraser laughed through his nose. I don't know why you'd say that. I'm just a bum. Jessie looked at Fraser. Why don't we go a flat together? What? We're best friends. We enjoy each other's company. We can keep each other on the straight and narrow. I don't know about that, Fraser said as he pressed a button on his Casio G-Shock watch. I'd be like your girlfriend or something. I'd look after you. Fraser's brow tightened. He looked Jessie up and down and Jessie started laughing idiotically. You know what I mean? Suppose I better head home, said Fraser, standing up and taking a great gulp from his can. Working tomorrow? Yeah, Jessie said. It had only just occurred to him how cold and damp his arse felt. Ministry. They drained and chucked their cans. A mild sense of panic came over Jessie as his brain lolled around drunkenly in his head, that if the police saw him, he'd be arrested, taken to a police station and thrown in prison when they found out he'd had a spliff. Why else would he be hanging out in a derelict block of flats if not for criminality and drugs? News would get out and the whole congregation would know. It might even get in the local papers. Young baptized brother caught trespassing and smoking weed. He followed Fraser down the stairs, the sorts of stairs he'd been up and down for years, ringing doorbells and tapping letterboxes, trying to find people in to preach to, posting copies of The Watchtower and Awake. He'd worked that actual block before, many times. It all felt a world away as they stumbled through the side yard back to the fence.
That's so beautiful. I just love that. What I find most moving about that, I think, is the purity of Jesse's vision for his future. He thinks of it in terms of this really pristine idea. Even if he then retracts that idea of being Fraser's girlfriend, he thinks of it. He has a very pure ideal of what he wants. And for me, that was one of the things that made it quite heartbreaking, that his experience when he moves to London is so distant from that. Even if it's not necessarily a case of, I don't think he would have been happy as Fraser's sort of pseudo girlfriend, but I think that just the fact that what he wants is something that he thinks of is so pure, and then he's sort of snatched away from any possibility of that, and the journey that he has of sort of reconstituting his idea of what he wants, I think is what makes one of the things that makes that book so special. Beautiful. Loved it.
Thank you. I mean, it's all about the heteronormativity and, you know, just the idea that Jess is brainwashed into thinking that that's all a relationship can be. So even when he does move to London and he's sort of 6 months later, you know, he's been through a few months of sex work, he's standing in front of his mirror in his bedroom on Christmas Day and thinking, do you know what, like, my penis is what's the problem here. If I was a girl, none of this would be happening. I'd be in a relationship with a man, like I'd probably be having a baby, like, you know, we could have all the sex that we want in the way that we want to have it. And nobody, like even nuns and priests would be blessing us for what we're doing. And it's just this sort of assumption of heteronormativity that like reminds me a little bit of when Nnenna's mother goes to a party with Jonathan as her plus one. And there's just this assumption that they are together or that there is something going on, especially as Nnenna is mixed race. People are assuming that her parents have to be a white woman and a black man. But I don't want to preempt what you're going to read. So what's your reading?
So why don't I read? There's a bit from the part where, in fact, when Nnenna's at school with some friends, and she has they've just been having lunch, and the food at their school is really not very good.
Right.
But I'm going to jump just after the bit where we see Nnenna and her friends, to the bit where we see Nnenna's boyfriend, because I think that's quite a pertinent bit. Nnenna's boyfriend, as I've said, is fine. He is all right. He's a perfectly average guy who is,
it's a great character, though.
Yeah. I love the distinction between the character and the person. As a character, I enjoy him a lot because actually his journey I really loved, but at the same time, as a person, he's not, and he's very visibly and very consciously not at Nnenna's level. I think that's the only bit that needs to be explained. So I'll just move that. Danny, mate, you're punching above your weight there. Danny's other friends, having eaten the same lunch as Nnenna, Hannah and Steph, were too stunned to speak. Instead, they communicated their agreement with a series of nods, and one belch that was so thick it was almost visible. Sam, the only boy left with powers of speech after the ordeal of the chicken surprise, had made the remark, but everybody had been thinking it. They picked out the remains of their food from between their teeth and silently wondered what they were. Most people are not in the position to realise the complexity of human beauty. Maybe it's advertising, maybe it's because somehow we never quite grow out of our teenage minds, but most people seem to be under a desperate illusion. Most people seem to think that beauty, especially for people who aren't men, is a thing that you have, the same way roses have a smell or responsible people have savings accounts. Nnenna, partly by virtue of not being white, knew better. Perhaps more than most people, she was sometimes beautiful and sometimes less so, depending on who was observing her at the time. Arguably, and beauty is always arguable, she fell short somehow of the standards of beauty in the country where she had grown up. And so she knew better than to think that beauty was something you could ever truly have or hold. No matter how you look, you can be beautiful to one person and utterly invisible to another. Being beautiful, Nnenna knew, is of little use in the painful moments, in the days, in the long hours, when you are ugly.
Oh, yeah. A lot went through my mind there. There's like a little moment where, the relationship between beauty and like ugliness, or, it's obviously sort of who's perceiving who. But like in Rainbow Milk, Jesse is sort of, when he's working in that first restaurant, and the actress sort of calls him over and says he looks like a young Michael Jackson, and says, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And the person who works with Jesse's father says, "He's, for me, he's a beauty, isn't he?" But then what Jesse on Christmas Day has this sort of tearful moment. And the only way he can stop himself from crying is by looking in the mirror, because his mother always used to tell him that he was ugly when he cried, and so he has to make himself laugh in order to stop crying. And so, there's a lot of, there's so many sort of comparisons that we can draw on from the two books. And I think definitely humor is one of them. I feel like, I don't know, what is your sort of like brand of comedy in terms of like, what are your influences? I mean, part of me thinks you must be watching like The In-Betweeners or something like that sometimes. Like some of the
I actually can't bear The In-Betweeners. I'm really
sorry. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody. I actually just can't bear it. My influences, I guess, would be things like, obviously, Zadie Smith, who I just, reading White Teeth, that was the first time I'd read in a formal setting any character, a story about characters who were mostly not white. Like it was, and it reflected the multicultural upbringing that I was familiar with. Was what was really strange for me about going to university was that, I'd grown up in Manchester, in South Manchester as well, which is a really diverse place. Like by the time I was by the time I went to secondary school, I'd had friends from every major world religion, and I just thought that was normal. I didn't realise that wasn't normal until I left Manchester when I was 18. And so I really, really wanted to write a story that reflected that, because to me, that is normal. Zadie Smith's White Teeth, I love that kind of British sort of Nick Hornby, Zadie Smith sort of style of humour. But I'm also influenced by farce. I love comedy in terms of things like, so I did a bit of acting at uni. I loved Chekhov, who wrote this comedy called The Bear about a man who goes to collect some debt from a widow, and she's sort of very ostentatiously grieving, and the two end up sort of arguing, and then they realise that they really want to have sex with each other, and it becomes this ridiculous farce whereby the most outlandish of things have a kind of synchronicity with each other in the end, which was really beautiful, and I really want to convey that. But also I think for me, comedy it's a lot, the way I use it, I think, is a lot to do with the British sensibility of, oh no, we can't talk about emotions. There are, the number of writers who, canonical certainly writers, who openly, boldly discuss this feeling. Like E.M. Forster will do it, because he'll just say, look, I'm going to talk about sadness now. I'm going to talk about loneliness. I'm going to talk about love. Are you ready? And they'll just do it for 5 pages. But most writers don't do that. And I think because as British people, we get really skittish about talking about our feelings, whether that's in person or in literature. And I think comedy really helps sugar that pill. So what I try to do a lot of the time is have a comedy that gives way to something more serious, because it sort of it is less off-putting, I think, to readers. It is much easier to swallow the pill of sadness if you've laughed at it first. What about you? Who are your influences in that respect?
Well, I would say, picking up on your point about Chekhov, one of my sort of favorite moments in literature is a short story of his. I can't remember what it's called. Something like, it's not The Lady with the Little Dog, because that's another short story, but he's basically, his main sort of male protagonist is on a train. He's in a train carriage, and opposite him you've got two very fine, very sort of, ostentatiously dressed women. And the window's open slightly, and one of the women has a little dog on her lap, and he's smoking a cigar, and the two ladies are chatting amongst themselves. And all of a sudden, apropos of nothing, one of the ladies grabs his cigar and throws it out of the window. So almost in the same breath, he grabs her dog and throws it out of the window. And I'm just like, that is brilliant. Absolutely savage. You kind of think of Chekhov as being like really sort of like dour and sort of, well, having said that, like Three Sisters, I think it was just the fact that it was sort of translated to the Nigerian Civil War, but like Inua Ellam's Three Sisters,
I wish I'd seen
that. Oh my god, it was so brilliant. It was so brilliant, so funny.
You Londoners get the best of everything. I hate you all.
We just have to make regular trips down to see us, darling. That's all it is. During the school holidays. That's why you became a teacher, so you can get long school holidays that you can come to London and see us. Amazing theatre that we've got going on there. But no, I don't really know if I have any sort of... I'll tell you who makes me laugh out loud constantly is Toni Morrison. Like, I can't even sort of figure out, like... I can't remember a particular scene, but like she's so kind of, she just doesn't care, and she just make anything happen to her characters. And
yeah, that's true.
Her work with voice as well is just so amazing.
She nails the way people talk. She
so does. The scene in Jazz where the little girl is pushing her brother in a pushchair, but then she goes back inside the house and leaves the child outside to go and get a record, and the child is kidnapped, and she sort of comes out running like, what's happened to the child, da, da, da. And there's like observers standing by saying, what, you've left your child on the street to go and get a blues record? You're gonna have the blues when your mother finds out what you've done with the child. It's just absolutely brilliant. Like,
yeah, She knows.
Yeah, I suppose black female humor is just everything. Like, I just spend a lot of time on social media just watching black women being really funny. And my mother, like, she could be many things, but sometimes she could be absolutely hilarious. Just by a look that she would give, or just like the way she would shrug her shoulders at something. And it's those kind of moments that I try to sort of like smuggle into my writing, just to sometimes just break up a moment, and just to show in a really, really tiny gesture an alternative perspective, which you can then sort of go on a tangent with. I don't know.
There was one more thing I wanted to talk about, because we sort of touched on it, but this idea of religion, which is another connecting point between our stories.
We should have started this at the beginning and had the whole chat about religion.
Yeah, true. But we're here now. Let's. It's so interesting, because something you said really struck me just earlier on with Jesse and his experience. Obviously, when he is cast out of this community, disfellowshipped, I think is the term. Yeah, isn't it? And obviously he's very young and vulnerable at that time, and you talk about how he has to find a new way of sort of seeing the world. I'm paraphrasing now. Sort of seeing the world. For Jonathan, it's different in a way, because he's very his exit from the religious community that he's in is much more. I think it's just as traumatic, but he doesn't face the same sort of isolation. But I just love the idea of religion framing how you see the world, because for Jonathan, even his eventual journey for him and the end of his journey, which I won't reveal, but when his journey does come to an end in the novel, he does see it in terms of religion. So I just wondered, in terms of biblical imagery, certainly, and I wondered if you could talk about that and how that maybe has affected your writing. Was the Bible an influence on you, for example?
Yeah, definitely. The translation of the Bible that the witnesses use is appallingly badly written. So for me, it was a case of like, how can I make this better? How can I make this sound better? But I gave Bible readings from my congregation's platform from like the age of 9.
Wow.
So you would sort of write an introduction, then you give the sort of 14 verse or whatever it is reading, and then you would adapt that knowledge for the congregation's needs. And so I was doing that from the age of 9. There's like what they have, it's called the Theocratic Ministry School. And basically you're given a Bible reading every few weeks, and you're marked on things like gestures, modulation. So basically they're trying to make orators out of us, and trying to sort of give us the conviction to go out and preach and to convince people of our argument.
Was that something that you chose to do, or something that you were sort of taken into? Is that just something everybody does, or is that something you felt
sort of like, I mean, you get sort of assigned a talk and you don't have to do it, but like, for me, it was a rite of passage. Because I really believed in what I was being taught. Being a witness was my whole world. So for me, it was a natural thing to do, was to start giving Bible readings, because I was a very fluent reader. It's interesting you were mentioning earlier about the writing that you used to do when you were a child. It made me think that, it made me remember that my first short story I wrote when I was 6 years old, it was a plagiarism of, did you ever see the film The Blob? About a giant blob of jam that takes over a whole village.
I don't think I did see it.
And chases people down the road. I mean, it's complete trash. But like, I was really affected by it when I was 6 years old, and I ended up writing, like, I was thinking that I was writing this original story. Actually, all I was doing was copying that. But that's essentially what you're told to do as a witness. You're not really taught to have your own perspective on things. You're taught to only regurgitate in sort of perhaps your own words if you want to, but it's still the same sort of tenets, the same ideas, the same doctrine. And for me, the big challenge, like even after I left the organization, even years after I left the organization, the big challenge for me was to figure out what I actually believed now. And, you know, you kind of leave the organization thinking everyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness is going to die at Armageddon. You're going
Yeah.
to die at Armageddon. Everyone out there is bad. They don't know Jehovah, so they're bad. And yet I was shown so much love by people who took me in and helped me. When I moved to Kent to study at university, I lived with a lady, a sort of 60-something white woman who'd never had a black person in her house before. And all of a sudden she's got this 19-year-old black kid with like cornrows. And she's like, oh, like, what am I supposed to do with you? But we got on so well, and she was so kind to me, and we had such a great relationship. And she listened to me talk about like all the things that had affected me in terms of my relationship with my parents and how that had broken down, and you know, what had happened to me since my disfellowshipping. And I'm like, you're supposed to die at Armageddon because you're supposed to be bad, but here you are, opening your house to me, giving me so much hospitality, giving me so much love. And it was that sort of made me realize that I could actually live in this world.
Yeah.
Because it's not just as cut and dry as the witnesses would have us believe.
And it's really so much about learning to have that same sort of conversion experience for yourself, isn't it? You know, having, certainly for Jonathan and to a lesser extent for myself, it's about realizing that you yourself are not going, you're not going to burn in hell for being who you are. That's not where your journey ends. It's about realizing, oh my goodness, I am doing these sinful things. You know, I'm not married to a woman. I don't love women. I'm not that person. That will never be my life. And yet, here I am. I am happy. On the way to happiness. I think, certainly for me, the narratives that I'm most interested in writing are narratives that are on the way to happiness rather than getting there.
Absolutely. Because we want to see that process and that thought process. Yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all. I'm just wondering if that's, as Terry, was that you giving me a subtle sign that we should?
No, I was just following.
Sorry,
I guess at some point
it's my teacher brain. I'm always thinking, right, how much time we've got left? Should we do a plenary? But
what I wanted to say was, very briefly, like, I loved your essay, okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Safe. So if you haven't seen this book, everyone, this is a book called Safe on Black British Men Reclaiming Space, edited by Derek Owusu. And I'm super jealous, like, not to have had a piece in here.
No.
But okay, your piece was about, it was an essay about wearing shorts in church. And sort of like, you know, questioning. It's a really interesting way of exploring two sort of modes of being. The person who sort of feels like they have to pay their dues to the thank you, Steve Bamlett, pink shorts.
They were indeed very shorts. They were really living. They got what you paid for those shorts. I'm not gonna lie.
So it's kind of, I mean, you don't even have to be gay to wear pink shorts these days. I mean, I think it probably,
but it helps.
Like, well, quite. But yeah, just these two very interesting sides of one person meeting in a place, and you know, the decision that I don't know if this is you or a sort of a character, I guess. I mean, it's an essay, so I'm guessing that it's.
No, it was me. It was me.
Right. But sort of going into church, which is something you've probably done all your life, but going as the new version of you, or a version of you that you are deciding is real and is true, and sort of making a very sort of firm and strong decision that you no longer want to have this relationship with the church and with God. And that's a really, really brave thing to do. And I thought it was a very, very important essay for that book as well. You know, there's 20-something black British men, all of whom have their own thing to say. But this is something that we don't talk about enough. The pressure that we are under as black men, being raised in Christian or Muslim or otherwise societies and backgrounds, like what it takes for us to express our individuality and be ourselves and decide who we want to be and what we want to learn and what we want to do. Is that something that, I mean, was that the particular time that which is contained in that essay? Was that the actual sort of awakening for you, that moment? Or was
so my awakening, I guess, happened gradually over a series of years. I stopped believing in God when I was about 17. But as I'm sure you'll know, and as Jesse's experience reflects in a different way in Rainbow Milk, just because you stop your relationship with God or relationship with the church, that doesn't mean, you've left one place, but that doesn't necessarily leave you in another.
Yeah, exactly.
Find your way to wherever it is that you are going to be next. And for me, that was definitely the case. It was a case of, okay, I'm not a church-going Christian anymore. That's not who I am. That's not what I believe. But how do I see the world differently? And for me, that essay was, I guess, about expressing the fact that although I've left a lot of I've left a lot of that behind. I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't believe in God. I don't read the Bible and see God there. But it's still a profound influence on me in the way I think about all sorts of things like forgiveness and, a lot of the stuff that I really valued about Christianity in the first place. A lot of that is really still there. I still think about forgiveness and the way that good and evil sometimes work in the world in terms of the painfulness of that battle. And really also, if you read the Bible, I'm not sure how many of you are Christians, but certainly if you read the Old Testament, God ain't all that nice all the time. And I think that really reflects a lot of the way that I see the world. It's quite hard for me to let that go because it's just part of how I see the world. But one of the things that really helped me on that sort of journey, I guess, was, so I'm part of this sort of social group in Manchester called Rainbow Noir, which is a wonderful, wonderful group set up by a couple of friends of mine who are, and it's for queer people of colour. So I've made friends from there. It's this wonderful sort of safe space where you can just be and meet people who you might not necessarily get to see in your everyday life. And it's this wonderful, wonderful group. And one of my friends from there, Ken, who is also a barber who did this, and he talked about how he loves sewing and he loves design and he loves fashion, and he talked about how at one point in his life, like he spoke to somebody who said, no, you can't give that up, because that is your ministry. That is the way that you express what God has given you to express. Now, I don't think of my life in terms of God anymore, but I think what you said about Black men and expressing our individuality, I think that really resonates with me, because I think you have a duty to try. It's that Marianne Williamson thing of who are you not to be beautiful and gorgeous, and it's we have a duty to bring out in ourselves the best of all of who we are. And I think that is a journey that is not often enough seen on screen and in literature. And we were talking just before the recording started about I May Destroy You.
I was thinking exactly that, yeah.
And I won't spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but one of the many things I loved about that is Kwame and his character, and the fullness of who he is seen. It's so easy. We see him first of all, this isn't really a spoiler, but we see him first of all in a very sort of stereotypically contemporary gay experience of having a hookup with a stranger that he doesn't know. And it's so easy to dismiss the gay experience as just this seemingly superficial thing. But what Michaela Cole does is she draws out of that and draws out of this character so many different aspects of him and his experience in a way that we need that so much more. We need that so much more often. His vulnerability on screen and his humanity and the rainbow of him and all of his colours, I just think is so important.
But it's quite radical for us to write Black male characters having full-on sex lives as well. And
yes.
because you know, we have to think about sometimes what our markets are likely to be, like who is, you know, likely to buy the fiction that we're making, and what do they want to see, and what is their idea of a black man. And sometimes it might be someone who's actually quite inoffensive and quite sort of very much about sort of not encroaching on other people's space. But then what of that is dictated by the gaze that's on them, which is a white gaze that's on them, and how much agency do they have to push back against that? And I think Jesse and Jonathan definitely have different ways of sort of dealing with that, and definitely have strong ways of dealing with that. I think from Jesse's perspective, I think it takes him a long time to become aware of other people's responses to his presence, as James Baldwin might say. So later on in the book, when he's sort of in his 30s, he becomes much more aware of racial microaggressions, which I think you, in Nnenna Maloney, you sort of tie those in throughout the book, and you make us very much aware of what your black characters are made aware of by white people's responses to their presence. And definitely in terms of the sex that Jesse has, it sort of directs his path, basically, because like he's this skinny black kid and he's sort of good looking and he's sexually active and he's well hung. So automatically he's sort of taken up as a sex worker and encouraged to do that. He's given money even before he decides to put his profile on Gaydar. He visits men who sometimes leave money out for him, sometimes give him money to take away, just because they think that he's like this poor black kid, and you know, and he just gives himself this kind of this way of playing into that. I suppose he plays himself into their hands in that way. But I guess my point is that sometimes we have to not shy away from stereotypes, but to show them as they are.
Yeah.
Because, you know, that, you know, to shy away from stereotypes is to say that black men don't have sex, which is not true.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the things that I talked about on a panel with the other writers of Safe, is that sometimes like the stereotypes can be a prison, especially because we are so often, I think especially in the Nigerian community, we are encouraged to shy away from the stereotypes of black men and sort of move towards, and I think that's where that education thing often comes from, this kind of the respectability politics. You know, you can't be that, you have to show them that you're this. So often, sort of because of that, it becomes this prison where you can't be all parts of yourself. You can't be angry. You can't be...
Yeah, exactly.
When actually, to be human is to be all of those things. And you know, what is needed is to free ourselves from this prison of can I or can I not be that. Well, you already are those things. You need to be able to, you need that freedom to express it and to explore those things and to be all of who you are, whether or not that fits a stereotype. And I think what was so glorious about the ending of, I'm not going to talk about the ending of Rainbow Milk, but
I thought you were going to talk about the ending of I May Destroy. I don't want to hear that. I've still got two episodes to watch.
Not to spoil anything. I'm not going to spoil anything. I caught myself just in time.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think what is wonderful about Rainbow Milk is that it explores that sort of journey from what Jesse should be to what he is, and that on his own terms. And I just wish we had more books like that. I do.
Well, I hear that you're writing one.
I am.
I hear you've got a second book coming out. Well, not coming out yet, but like you're sort of it's on its way.
Yeah. So
can you talk about it at all, or?
I can, yeah, a little bit. It's still very much a work in progress. So it's going to come out in spring 2022. So it's still a way off. But it is a story about exclusively Nigerian British men. Some of whom are gay, and two of whom are gay, and one of whom is straight. And it's about, I can't really reveal the plot too much yet because it's still very much in progress, but what I can say is that it's about themes of masculinity and queer black masculine love, queer black male love rather, and fatherhood and family and identity. And it's about one of the things that I'm passionate about writing, which is people who don't need to help each other, helping one another. One of the things that I sort of experienced growing up was, as much as I was very privileged in some ways, my family situation as a child was not a happy one. And so I became very dependent on families that were not my own. And what I guess the way that really influenced the way I see the world, in that I think that family can be a wonderful thing, but I think we need to be able to look beyond the nuclear family, and look outside of those and be able to express non-romantic love beyond those, in order for people to be happy and safe. We just need that. So that's part of the story that I'm writing, which I'm really excited about, but also kind of terrified to be writing a second book. Is it
as hard as people say it is? People often say that the second book's much harder than the first one.
I mean, it's been hard, but it's also partly been hard because of lockdown. Right. So, I mean, honestly, the highs and lows of writing a book are magnified so much during lockdown. It's just because even in any case, even without lockdown, the self-doubt of writing is just a part of how it works. So you're just not sure all the time about whether or not what you're writing is what you want it to be, never mind whether or not it's good. Yeah. And so to be in lockdown, it's like, oh my God, this is brilliant. No, that's terrible. No, it's great. No, it's awful. It's like it's magnified so much. But to have a draft of it that I'm now editing and figuring out, it feels really good to have that.
And you're a teacher as well, so I mean, I just did absolutely in awe of you for the amount of work that all must take. Like, how do you manage to compartmentalize your time?
It's partly because of habits. I've been teaching for 6 years now, and I've always wanted to publish a novel, but I think if it happened any earlier in my teaching career than it had done, I would have really struggled. Don't get me wrong, I've always had to work really, really hard at it. I've always, I've worked ridiculously long hours as a teacher, and then as a writer, I've written until, whatever hour in the morning, and then just woken up and done it again. But because I've had a few years of experience now, and I went through a really tough training program, it means that I have resources that I can reuse and adapt. It takes me much less time to plan now than it did at first. Teaching is one of those jobs where, I don't know if there's any teachers in the audience, but it's one of those jobs where it's so hard at first. When I first started teaching, it would take me an hour to plan a 45-minute lesson. Now, 5 minutes, if that. And thank God, because if I didn't have that time, I think I would not be able to do it. But yeah, it's just been very, very hard. Teaching and writing they're just very demanding jobs that you can't do by looking down your nose at them. You can't do half-heartedly. When you've got children in front of you who need your attention and your devotion, there isn't very much else you can do but give it to them. When you've got a book that you're passionate about and a story that you have to tell, as you know, you just have to tell it. It's a very painful thing to have. I can't remember who said it. There's a very famous quotation, but it's a very painful thing to have a story inside you that you need to tell that you can't tell or that you haven't told.
James Baldwin used to sort of work 3 jobs or something, and work during the day and then write at night when he knew that he'd have quiet. Which I don't know. I mean, he's just from another planet, isn't he? I don't know how he did that.
He really is. I mean, yeah, he just seems like he's a miracle of history, James Baldwin, I think.
Yeah, he is, especially to be such a trailblazer. But Terry, how are you doing? Are we?
I think we're. I mean, I'm having to just put on the sort of moderator hat a little bit, because I just want to keep listening to you talk forever. But I think we probably should wrap it up and maybe turn it over. One thing I realized, I was listening to you both talking so much that I forgot to put any of the links of where to get your books in the chat. So I'm now going to press enter, and that's going to people.
Okay.
That's where you can get the books. And
fabulous.
If you're not convinced by this discussion about the fact that you absolutely need to read these books, then I don't know what will come.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to ask a question, I reckon a couple of questions. You can just post it in the chat, and then I will unmute. And yeah, if anyone has anything they want to ask right now, then I guess the time is to do so. Thank you so much for this discussion and for your readings and for your books. I'm really enchanted. I've just been sort of sitting here, and Charlotte, my business partner, has just been watching me sort of gush up a bit and get really. So thank you so much. These books have so much in common. There's so much more that you could really go into from. I mean, it's just wonderful. From Shakespearean characters popping in and out, and the music, which hasn't really been discussed, which is huge.
Oh yeah, music.
Music.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. We could
Okay.
get there, couldn't we?
Steve, do you want to ask this question yourself, and then I'll just unmute you? Hang on. Here we go. Ask to unmute. I think that's the way we do this. Ask to unmute. Is that working for you?
I think so. It's just that you both talked about vulnerability in men growing up queer, and black and queer, more importantly. You said something earlier about not hiding that or making that totally, open to the reader. But I think you both use irony as well, and so I'm sort of puzzling a bit about the use of irony and comedy and the fact that sometimes these people who are vulnerable don't know quite why they're vulnerable. Their interpretation isn't the only one. Sorry, that's not very clear.
No, that's a really great question. It is a really interesting question. I think that's the hardest thing. There's probably a biblical quotation about like the man who is blind and does not know he is blind. It sounds like something Jesus would say, right? But yeah, I think that definitely relates to. I mean, in my novel, I think one of the hardest things for Nnenna is that she doesn't really know what she doesn't know. She's just aware that there's a father out there, and she doesn't know where he is or why he isn't there at the time. And I think you mentioned something about vulnerability, and for her, that's because how can she navigate a space whose terrain she doesn't know? How can she find her way to there, from here to there, when she doesn't know where there is? And I think that is really what makes it so vulnerable. Her mother, Joni, all the characters are lost in their own way. Joni is lost, her mother's lost because she is in a relationship with a child who she doesn't quite know how to raise, and she's in a job that she finds unsatisfactory and boring and unchallenging. But she knows what it is that she wants. Whereas with Nnenna, how can she literally does not have the language to express herself in the way that she ought to have inherited. And I think that is, for me, one of the most important parts of her story. And for Paul, what about you? Because of course you've got Jesse and his journey too.
Yeah, and it's very similar to Nnenna in terms of growing up without the black parent or without the black father figure, which is probably even more pronounced in Jesse's case because Jesse himself will be a black man one day, and so he's not ever been prepared for what it will mean one day to be a black man. His white stepfather and adoptive father do not sort of engage with him in that way. So Jesse ends up, and he's not allowed to listen to rap or anything like that because of the swear words and the misogyny and all of those kinds of things potentially. So what he does learn about being black is this kind of third-hand experience. Yes. So when he's working at McDonald's, for example, his colleagues sort of josh with him and say, you're like a black man trying to be a white man trying to be a black man. Yes. And that's how he sort of, and I suppose that's a source of embarrassment for him. His adoptive father gets told by his colleagues, because he can dance and he's married to a black woman, that he's like a black man in a white man's body. So I think the problem that we face quite often is we value people's opinions too much. And there's a tiny scene, I hope it's not too much to give away, there's a tiny scene in I May Destroy You, where Arabella is in fancy dress on Halloween, is it? And she goes off on her own after getting pissed off by her friends. And she ends up trying to find a charger for her vape and in the smoking area of a pub. And a guy comes up to her and sort of like says something about her costume. And she says, why do you always have to have an opinion? Like, why do you always think that, your opinion matters? if only we had that, we were vulnerable, and if only we had that strength at that time when we were boys to say, this is me, this is who I am, like it or lump it. I'm not your idea of what a black man is. I'm not your idea of what a religious person is. I'm not your idea of what a gay person is. I'm not your idea of what and this is what I really hope for in future. This is what I really want us to take away from this moment of pause that's been forced upon us through the coronavirus pandemic. Just the access to education that young people need so that they can see themselves reflected in literature, in the curriculum when it comes to history and all of those things, so that they are not forced down a route that is anathema to them as individuals. So that I should have been as a gay black man, I should have been studying Baldwin. As the son of a black woman, I should have been studying Toni Morrison. I should have been studying Bernardine of Aristo. I should have been studying The Emperor's Babe to sort of have an idea of black people being in London and in the UK in the 2nd century. Do you know what I mean? Which is true. That is exactly what happened. But, it's not until you're 35 years old and you're reading Peter Fryer's Staying Power that you realize that there were black people in Britain in Roman times, and that Britannia was once ruled by a half Libyan man. And people are saying to you, go back to the jungle because your family's only been here since 1948 or whatever. We need this access to education so that we're not growing up ignorant, because what happens is we get to an age where we realize that the whole of our life so far has been a lie. And that is really bad for mental health. That is really bad for self-esteem, really bad for confidence. It's very destructive. And so what I do want to take forward is a renewed concentration on just different voices being brought to the table when it comes to children's education. Because then there just won't be these moments as much going forward.
Definitely. Like, my word, as a teacher, actually one of the nice things about lockdown is that because of the way the lockdown has worked and my timetable has worked, I've had even more freedom to teach the kinds of things that I want to teach. So I've had the chance to do...
I was going to ask you, really, which one?
Yeah, Giovanni's room.
Amazing.
With the 6th form class that I teach. I always try and teach something that is maybe a little bit outside of the students' experiences. So I've taught Chidi Ochebe before to my GCSE class. I've taught a novel. I teach a novel called A Separate Piece now because Chidi Ochebe's novel's taken off the syllabus. They rotate the syllabus, but A Separate Piece now, which I love because it's about male friendship in a way that is kind of borderline queer, that I think raises questions that we need to be talking about and thinking about from an early age. And I think it's and so one of the lovely things in lockdown is I've had that chance to. I did Giovanni's Room and I did another novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Bowden, because I thought that's just the kind of thing they just would never read. But yeah, that's actually been one of the joys of lockdown. I've had a little bit of freedom, and in fact, I'm with one of my other classes, I did Dinesh Smith's Summer Somewhere. Not all of it is very long, but in sections I did, and it's been lovely to have that opportunity to show them, okay, here is a queer black man who identifies, a queer black poet rather, who identifies as they, and we're going to learn about them and we're going to learn about their work, and that is a really valid, great thing to do that I think you'll enjoy. That's a wonderful freedom that I've had, so it's been really great.
Amazing.
But
what, one of my other hopes is that religion doesn't sort of get in the way of that. Because as we've seen at schools in Birmingham, for example, like with that sort of picket outside a school where the headmaster was sort of very happy to teach a sort of gender diverse and sexual orientation diverse curriculum. All of a sudden you've got people from all kinds of religious communities surrounding that school with pickets saying, this is against our religion, da, da, da. What is against my religion is discrimination and ignorance. All of these things that people have to go through, like, what we're seeing, the results of that ignorance is what we're seeing in terms of a certain very, very high-selling author at the moment who is using her platform to take down trans people. Like, go back to school.
I mean,
that is because you didn't. Seriously, I just can't. I can't.
There's
Sorry,
not
I
enough
don't want to get in trouble
for us to for me to properly say what I think about that author, because
I know.
what disappointment. I mean,
I haven't even read any other books though.
Drops the mic. That's the worst that you can say to a writer. Like, who are you? Who are you? I haven't. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't recognise you. Nice earrings though.
Yes. Beautiful gowns. Beautiful gowns.
But really, like, I mean,
Yeah.
do we know why she's doing this? I mean,
I think it's so cynical as well, the harnessing of sort of the abuse of cisgendered women to defend transphobia. I think it's terrible. I think it's awful. But yeah, you're right. We know what's going on.
I mean, I honestly don't actually. Like, I do not know what's going through her head. Like, I really do not know what is going through her head. Why does she have to open her mouth? Why does she have to write to her 4 million followers or whatever it is on Twitter and talk shit for? Like, why?
I think
Shut up.
I think she's just read too many Tumblrs written by people who've never read books about this sort of thing or read it, and just sometimes I think maybe, do you know what? Maybe you're just tired. You're right. Maybe you just need a nap. Like, I know what I'm like about it. I work too hard sometimes, and you know, do you just need a nap? Do you just need like a nap and some ice cream? Because that is okay. You can just take some time. That's fine.
And she's got enough rooms in her castle to take plenty of naps.
Well, true say.
Seriously, like,
yeah,
I just don't get it.
Yeah, and that is so disappointing, because almost irrespective of what people write, we look to writers as guides, don't we? You know, we value writers for that wisdom, and there are so many people who look up to this particular writer because she's a children's fiction writer, and have looked up to her since their youth. Like,
yeah,
that's incredibly disappointing. To have a message of hate from somebody in such a position, it's incredibly disappointing.
Well, she's got huge responsibility.
Yeah. And how does that strike you? Like, you know, as writers ourselves,
yeah,
you know, a lot of we are writing the same kinds of things as her, obviously, but that responsibility of a writer. In fact, what am I doing? I'm asking a question. I don't have the right to ask questions. This is time for them to ask questions.
Does anybody want to ask a question?
There is a question.
Yeah, for a few more questions.
There is a question from Joe.
Hi, Joe.
It says, "Can it be read out?" So this has been great. Thanks, both. I'm planning/writing a novel. Do you have any advice on pulling together a plot you are happy with? I have so many loose strands in my head, and I don't know where to begin.
Paul, do you want to get that one?
Yeah, you went first last time, so I'll go first, I suppose, this time. I don't know what to say, though, but I suppose, like, every book has its own process, and you just have to give it time and see, like... So as I was saying at the top, you know, the reason for me to write Rainbow Milk was to explain to myself what the trajectory of my life was between the ages of 17 and 22, to have two such extremes. Like, how did I get from there to there? And, like, what does this mean for my future, etc. And through lots of different drafts, lots of different sort of influences coming in from my publisher, like stuff that I was reading, etc., that idea grew. But then I had to turn it into a third-person narrative so that I could gain distance from it. But it was then that I kind of realized that I had other pieces of writing. So the last section, the book's in 5 sections. The last section of the book is set in Suffolk, and it's sort of 15 years later. So Jessie is grown up and has a different life. And that wasn't something that was originally part of Rainbow Milk. I bought that in very much at the last minute. Also, the first section is set in 1959 and is a Jamaican man who has been living in the UK for 3 years. He has become disabled he's lost his sight. He's got 2 small children who he has to look after at home while his wife goes out to work. And it's basically a monologue from him sort of telling us like what his life's like, what his fears and hopes are for his children, and sort of flashing back to moments back in Jamaica and in the earlier parts of his British experience to sort of show us the trajectory of his story. Again, that was something completely separate. But it was when I saw the 3 parts side by side, I brought them together, because then I thought, wow, now I have a novel. Because it's something that spans a 70-year period. It shows 3 generations of Black British men descended from one another, sort of showing us what has and what hasn't changed about their experience. And I wouldn't have sort of got there. I mean, the book ended up being published a year later than originally planned, because I took so much longer over it. And I'm just lucky enough, like Oki and I are lucky enough that we have a publisher who is, you know, so patient and just wants the absolute best for us and will fight at every corner. And, you know, this is her reputation at risk as well. You know, she is hired by powers that be to run an imprint looking for underrepresented voices. She's got a job to do. So when she turns around and says, yes, I'm going to publish Paul in April 2019, and still in November 2019, there isn't a manuscript. November 2018, there isn't a manuscript. And in January 2019, he's like, I'm sorry, I can't give you that. Like, I have to take it back. She has to go back to them and justify that, because that's budget and everything that gets involved. So she fought my corner the whole time and made sure that I only handed in a novel that I was absolutely satisfied with. And it's just so much a better novel for that. So that you know, that's a very long way of saying, give it time. Don't sort of be so sort of one-track minded about it. Let other things happen. You know, I threw all my material up in the air and saw where it fell, and that's what the novel ended up being. You know, you will have, you know, the longer you spend with your work and sort of the more diverse you are in terms of your thinking and in your writing, the more magical the experience will be, the more sort of like amazing eureka moments you'll have. And that's all to our benefit as readers.
I mean, I completely agree. The only thing I would add to that is, I think you just have to write it and accept that it's going to be what it is in a first draft. It might be confused and you might have strands that lead nowhere and all sorts of things, but you know, you just, I always quote Dolly Parton when I'm talking about this, because she has this wonderful quotation where she talks about how you have to find out who you are and do it on purpose. And with a novel, I think you have to do the exact same thing. You just have to do it and then do it by accident, and then figure out what it is you're trying to do once you've got it in front of you, and then think, oh, okay, here's my vision. And now I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to try to do it this time.
Right. Well, that's the thing as well. Like, you know, the sort of slightly accidental things that make your first novel what it is, people are going to be expecting that, and you're going to expect that of yourself as well.
Yeah.
But you know, you look back and think, well, how did I achieve that? It's not chance anymore, it's technique now.
Yeah.
And that's like a really hard thing to keep up. But great Dolly Parton quote. My favorite Dolly Parton quote is, "It cost a lot of money to look this cheap."
I love it. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. I love that quotation so much. It's like a humble, like a subtle flex, as well
exactly.
as
Love Dolly Parton. Love. Yeah. We didn't talk about music.
No, we didn't.
Did you listen to a lot of music when you were writing? Part of your process?
Yeah, I did. And in fact, I listened to a lot of music, especially with the second one now. Yeah, I think I listen to a lot of music when I'm thinking about the idea, but I find music distracting when I'm writing. Like the second one, I've listened to, you know, Imogen Heap's Good Night and Go, which has been covered by Ariana Grande.
I know of it.
I love that song. That really, it didn't give me the idea for the second novel, but it really helped me crystallize the mood.
Oh, really?
Create. at least in an early version of the story. Yeah. And of course, music is so crucial to your novel as well. Like, it's, there's a soundtrack to the story.
Yeah. I think you said something earlier about process as part of the story.
Yeah.
And that's definitely applicable here. I made lots of playlists. So I can't generate new text while listening to music very often. That you have to be sort of in a quite sort of concentrated place. But when it was, the research time and just sort of sketching out ideas, I did listen to a lot of playlists. And that music ended up being part, because obviously my work is semi-autobiographical. And for me, music is a really sort of important anchor to memory. So, I'll give you an example. I was at this is going to make you jealous again because it's theatre related.
Oh, okay.
But,
tell me.
Lyric Hammersmith, just before the lockdown, to see Love, 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 which is a play in 3 parts and set in sort of the 60s in 1990, and then sort of the other day, if you like. And there's 2 intervals. And at the end of the first interval, we sort of retook our seats, and It Must Have Been Love by Roxette playing on a loop to set us up for the 1990 section. And I hate that song. Like, I'm not a fan of Roxette at all. Like, rest in peace, she died last year. But, I hated all that sort of soft rock, Bon Jovi, all of that kind of world when I was growing up. I just wanted to listen to R&B. So, but because I've never listened to that since, hearing it at the theatre, I just went through this like incredible Proustian involuntary memory moment where I was all of a sudden sat at my parents' dining room table, and I was studying my Watchtower. I had my Bible in front of me. I'm 8 years old. And in front of me, there's a shelf like quite high up on the wall. And on that shelf is a collection of a box set of children's literature. It was The Tales of Huckleberry Finn, it was Moby Dick, and it was Robinson Crusoe. And a family friend had bought it for us, and my mum had put it on this very high shelf and said that we weren't allowed to touch it. And for me, that I'd never thought about that until this moment, sitting in the theatre listening to, because that song was playing on the radio back then in 1990. Do you know what I mean? And so music is an incredible, like if you're writing about your own experiences, music is an incredible tool for accessing memories and for just giving it like real detail and color. Like I would not have been able to make that up, but that's a plot there in terms of like a young 8-year-old kid on a Saturday afternoon. The radio's on, his mother's in the living room, there's a speaker in the dining room blasting out this music. He's studying the Watchtower and the Bible for his Sunday meeting the next day. And there's a set of children's literature up there that he's not allowed to touch. Yeah. And why? Especially then if you're sort of writing from that boy's perspective as an older man looking back on this moment, there's just so much there that can be explored and unpacked. It's almost my own access to, because I can't afford to go and see a shrink, but it's almost my own access to being able to unpack things from my past. Just honestly, like my dad sent me a picture the other day of me aged 2.5, and I don't have any pictures of myself as a child. My parents and I don't talk, so like the fact that he's just sent me this message out of the blue is insane. Wow. But it's a picture of my parents and me, and my mum's got her arm around my waist, and it's like 1985. And for some reason, a song called Trapped by Colonel Abrams, which was a hit that year, came into my head. So I started playing that on repeat. And it just gave me so much more access to the atmosphere of that moment. And it was like a real kind of like thing, because you're kind of thinking, wow, like what happened to that family who looks so happy and are sort of enjoying each other at that time? What happened to us? I almost ended up writing a letter to my parents. Like, I mean, I did write a letter to my parents, but I haven't sent it yet.
Yeah. I mean, that's therapy.
Exactly. They're not ready for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, music, for me, it just sort of really helped me to... Also, what you can do with a playlist is you can sort of turn it into a narrative.
which you really did in a sense in Rainbow Milk.
Yeah, you can sort of give it like you can make songs tell your story. So
Yeah.
you start off with you know, in you know, if we're looking at Jess's sort of story like
Let's
chronologically,
turn the light on. I'll be right back.
it is rather dark there, darling, I have to say.
Yeah.
That's better. You know, in terms of chronology, Jess's story probably starts at the end of the book. So I'm not going to give you a spoiler there, but there's a song that gives him access to a memory that basically solves a lot of problems for him in terms of the and let's just say paternal subjects that he's not ever been exposed to. And it's through a song that he is able to access that memory. And then you're going all the way through to him at the end of the book in 2016, listening to Beyonce's Lemonade and Solange's A Seat at the Table on a loop, on repeat, and walking around his old estate and, you know, accessing, almost reprogramming his memories and using that music and using the relationship that he has with Beyonce and Solange and their music, using that as a means of being able to sort of reprogram the trauma that he went through as a young man. And I definitely almost added a 2019 section so that I could have Solange's When I Get Home as part of the novel. But I thought, you know what, I can't really do that. I'm really late.
That's book
in the
2.
manuscript now.
That's the sequel.
Exactly.
That is Rainbow Milk, the remix. There is time.
Exactly.
I think we've been going. You know, we've been going 2 hours.
Oh my god! I thought I was hungry.
I checked the time just now when I went back to my screen. I was like,
2 hours.
Oh my god!
And actually, I don't know if you know this, Paul, but on Spotify there is a playlist that I was listening to as I read your book.
I made it, but like, thank you.
I thought you made it. Well, great, thank you. Because
no problem.
Because I was reading and I was like, I need to listen to this song now, and then I just sort of I thought, maybe someone made it. Yes, Paul made it.
Well, I think with future reprints of the book, I think I'm definitely going to have the link in there, or just sort of a note to say search Rainbow Milk by a playlist by Paul on Spotify. Because so many people have sort of sent me messages saying, is there a playlist for this? Like, you know, I've been trying to make one on YouTube, but it's like 7 hours of music.
Yeah.
It's like 90 something separate tracks, like some of which are like half an hour long. Like the Wagner piece is like half an hour long. Like,
yeah.
So when you play that on shuffle and the Wagner comes on, you're like, I know what this is, but skip. Like, generally speaking, though, I wouldn't skip. But it's good. It's fun. And the thing is, like, writing, above all, should be fun.
Yes.
And it should be everything that you enjoy doing. Everything that you enjoy doing should be part of it. For me, I love music. I love football. And I almost had like a whole sort of football narrative going on in there, but like I decided to leave that out. I love acting, and you know, I was able to sort of inhabit characters through acting. You know, I blindfolded myself to walk around my house. I was living with a couple who had a 2-year-old son who left his toys everywhere, and I blindfolded myself to walk around the house to feel what Norman's life would be like living with 2 children, being blind in a cramped English house. You know, and that's fun. It was almost not fun when I almost fell down the stairs and broke my neck, but.
You got to suffer for your art, Paul.
Exactly. But I think people just have this very stilted view of what writing is, that it just has to be you sitting at a desk and sort of being really sort of intense. That's part of it. Yeah. But also, you know, your process can be whatever you want. And I think that's what we should stress to people, especially people who aren't sort of, you know, middle-aged white men, you know.
Yeah.
We are
She's
allowed
method,
to bring
everyone. She's method.
Exactly, method writing, exactly. We've coined it. But we're allowed to bring our individuality to it. That's what it's all about. Like, people don't want a white male novel from us because they've got white males to write that. They want us.
Yeah.
What's really,
That's
truly
beautiful.
us. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Anyway, another mic drop.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, no. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't really know what to say to close it out. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And, yeah, please read these books and follow them. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you so much. And,
Pleasure.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
I'm gonna end the old recording here.
Okay.
No,
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.